Today we have with us on the line someone who I've wanted to speak to for a long time. We have alternative, I guess you can say, Egyptologist John Anthony West with us. He is behind the DVD series Magical Egypt, and he's written extensively on the subject. To name a few of his titles, Serpent in the Sky, The High Wisdom of Ancient Egypt, The Traveler's Key to Ancient Egypt, and The Mystery of the Sphinx. His website that you definitely should take a look at is jawest.net. That's for John Anthony West. So go there and take a good look around. There's loads of material up there for you. So with that, welcome to the program, John Anthony West. Thank you very much for coming on.
Well, thank you, Henrik, and thank you for inviting me.
It's excellent. I'm really looking forward to this. There's so much to talk about, but I do want to kind of run over a little bit of the background, if you will, for our listeners that potentially haven't heard about you or your work before. So if you will, tell us a little bit how you kind of got involved and how your interest got, how we got started looking at Egypt, as it were.
Okay, how my interest actually got distracted into Egypt is more like it.
Right.
But it's a long story, which would sometimes occupy a couple of hours on a bus in Egypt, but I won't go into a couple of hours worth. Just briefly, at a very early age, 13 or so, I realized I'd been born into a lunatic asylum, and it was a fairly shattering understanding, since practically nobody shared it at that time. Now, with the whole world melting down, right on schedule, I might add, just about everybody knows that the whole thing is insane. But I knew this way back when, age 13, that's 1945. And by the time I was 19, I knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to be the little boy who said the emperor has no clothes. And I started out in that direction, but with no thought of scholarship. Basically, I was writing satirical, creative work, a novel, book of short stories, number of plays, some screenplays that didn't get done, but that got written. And at a certain point, actually, on my website, there's a story called a short story called "The Emperor's New Clothes Continued," picking up the story where Hans Christian Andersen left off. And what happens in my story is that when the little child says the emperor has no clothes in the story, because it's a fairy tale, everyone says, "Ah, the emperor has no clothes." But in real life, what happens is that the empire regroups and eventually proves that it's the little child who's imaginary and the emperor's new clothes are real.
Right. That's a
funny
good
story.
One. Yeah.
That got published in the now defunct Omni magazine. Anyway, so I was living, when my first short story was published, which is back in 57, I was working in Madison Avenue in advertising as a copywriter. And all of a sudden there was my first short story accepted, and I said, the hell with this, I'm not a copywriter, I'm a real writer. And off I went to, and then, again, a long story how I got there, to the wild island of Ibiza, which was hippie haven back through the late 50s. Well, that's pre-hippie days. I antedate the hippies. and it was a wild place, and a lot of people, mostly getting stoned and drunk, and a few of us getting some work done while getting stoned and drunk, I might add.
Right.
And anyway, through a strange set of circumstances, I got interested in these subjects. First in astrology, through a good friend of mine who was a Dutch novelist, a very accomplished Dutch novelist. And then that led me, by a series of strange steps, to the Gurdjieff work. And that was and continues to be my home. But through the Gurdjieff work, at a certain point, I realized that to do the discipline, in other words, just thinking about stuff doesn't serve any purpose. You have to actually do it. It's like, a path is something that you walk on. It's like playing a sport or playing the violin. You can listen to it from now till doomsday, but until you actually do it, you're not doing it. So anyway, I wanted to get into one of the schools that followed Gurdjieff's teachings, and that involved getting me to taking me from Ibiza, where I'd already spent 9 years, to England. And there in my Gurdjieff group, through another strange series of circumstances, I I got a contract to write a book on astrology. I called The Case for Astrology, now out of print. But I was convinced that through by now, a lot of study, that astrology was not a Chaldean, Babylonian superstition rationalized by the Greeks, but that it went back much earlier. And this was this basically was the same thing that Gurdjieff would be talking about on his take it or leave it basis. I mean, he's an extraordinary man, Mr. Gurdjieff was.
Yes.
And all of a sudden, here was this contract to write a book called The Case for Astrology, which is not a how-to book. It doesn't tell you what a good day to buy a poodle is or invest in a stock. Well, nowadays, no day is a good day to invest in a stock.
That's right.
But through somebody in the group, I was working on the history of astrology, trying to plumb back to demonstrate that it was much, much older. And somebody introduced me to the work of R.A. Schwaller de Lubitsch, the French genius with the unpronounceable name.
Yes.
And his books at that time were not yet translated out of French, and my French was pretty rudimentary, but nevertheless I attacked it, and for about 10 months, went every day across London to the British Museum, fighting my way through the impenetrable Schwaller with a dictionary by my side, and that ended up as a long chapter in the initial publication of The Case for Astrology. And once I got hold of Schwaller, I realized initially I thought he must have been a Gurdjieff pupil. They were both in Paris at the same time, but he wasn't. There was no connection between the two men. But what Schwaller was doing on the scholarly level was effectively demonstrating everything that Gurdjieff was talking about. And one of the things I must say that appealed to me about Gurdjieff was that he was the first person I had ever encountered, although posthumously he died in 1949, who was as contemptuous of all of Western civilization as I was. And the difference was that he knew how to live in it, and I didn't, not very well.
Right.
So that was really one of the main attractions. And anyway, there was Schwaller, and I realized almost upon opening the book that he had done something of inestimable value. He had demonstrated through absolutely impeccable scholarship that the old belief percolating down from Greece and through the Renaissance itself, the belief that ancient Egypt was the source and fount of all of Western wisdom, this was taken as a matter of trust actually right up to about the 19th century, when the Church of Progress took over from the decrepit and degenerate Church of Rome. And Schwaller had actually he'd reformulated the sacred science of the Egyptians, of the ancients in general, because Egypt wasn't the only place that had this knowledge. The Chinese had it, and the Indians had it, the Mesoamericans had it. The difference with Egypt really is that there's so much of it left. I mean, you can actually go and immerse yourself in the sacred science of Egypt just by going there, whereas in all of these other civilizations, there's really very little left of them that you can experience. You can read about it, it's all there, the doctrine is all there, and the doctrines are all basically the same. I mean, they take it as a premise, as a given, that we human beings are not accidental glitches in an accidental universe, but that rather that we have a specific role to play, which is the acquisition of a level of consciousness that we are not born with, but that we have the potential to reach. And this is what in Egypt is called the doctrine of immortality, and what in other civilizations is called samadhi or nirvana or whatever. I mean, different names for it. But basically, it's the same doctrine that we're here for a reason, and if we don't pursue that path, we do so at our peril. And actually, it's very interesting where we are at the moment, because all of this crash that's engulfing the entire world now is a consequence of a fraudulent and debased materialistic philosophy. In any event, there was Schwaller, and I, in the first astrology book, I even though it didn't fit really, I put in a long chapter about Schwaller, because, as I said, he hadn't been translated out of the French, and he was scarcely known in France either. And that chapter intrigued publishers, and they came to me and asked if I would do a book on Schwaller, and I said, you bet, because I regarded that as actually more to my liking and interest even than the astrology, which was partial. But the Egyptian doctrine was, you might say, a template of how a civilized society actually comports itself. So 6 years later, there came The Serpent in the Sky. And while doing the research for that, I came across a single line of Schwaller's about the Great Sphinx, that the Great Sphinx, Schwaller's line was, and of course the Great Sphinx of Giza shows unmistakable signs of water erosion. And that dropped the penny in the slot. Schwaller, that was in one of his ancillary books in English called Sacred Science, The King of the Pharaonic Theocracy. And he himself, I think, did not recognize the bombshell that he dropped. In any event, he died about a year later, because the notion that the Sphinx was weathered by water, I'm not a geologist, but I knew enough about Egyptian geology to know that the Sahara was a relatively new desert. It's been pretty much bone dry since about 4000 BC, and it formed about 10,000 BC. And I realized that if you could prove that the Sphinx was weathered by water, you would, in a single stroke, subvert all of ancient history as it's taught to us, which is that it starts off very primitive and it's all hunter-gatherers, and then at some point or another civilizations arise, and eventually we end up with our enlightened selves, with our hydrogen bombs and our bobblehead dolls and our Walmarts and our supermarkets. and I realized that if you could prove that the Sphinx, put it this way, for the Sphinx to be weathered by water, it means it has to have been built at a time when there was water in Egypt. And that takes us way back, without going into the details, but probably before 10,000 BC. So then you're confronted, then you've got a big problem if you're an academic, or as I call them, a quackademic. It means that the most spectacular sculpture on Earth, and the Sphinx most assuredly is, was carved at a time when there's not supposed to be any civilization at all. And perhaps even more important in terms of our modern intellect, the temples right immediately in front and adjacent to it are not huge as Egyptian temples go, but they're built of blocks of stone, fit into place like pieces in the jigsaw puzzle. That weigh anything from 50 to 150, even more tons each. So we couldn't do that today. Actually, we've done. I don't know if you've seen The Mystery of the Sphinx. That was the big documentary that we did with Charlton Heston. The experts in these fields, the people who deal with lifting heavy blocks of whatever these days, have cranes big enough to maneuver blocks of stone that size, but they wouldn't, in fact, know how to rig them. So, in other words, we're confronted with something built when there's not supposed to be any civilization at all that we couldn't build today, and we don't know how they built it either. I mean, this is quite clear. We don't know how they did it. Yeah. Quackademics insist that it was enough guys with ropes and levers, and that's how it's done.
Yeah.
But the engineers say, well, no, we couldn't do that. So this, in and of itself, really, I mean, it's a gigantic paradigm shift. I mean, it's very simple. There's the Sphinx, weathered by water, and the geologists all agree with this now, or most of them agree with it.
They do?
Most of them. Yeah, there are a few who don't, and those are sort of tame Egyptological geologists. And the big plan, maybe I'll get into this later, is to get over there. It's a long, convoluted story, but the idea is to get a panel of independent geologists together to go over there and to confront a panel of their geologists and duke it out on the spot, and may the better theory win.
Right.
So this we've got. This is part of the plan. Yes, go on.
Oh, no, I just wanted to ask you regarding the water. One thing that always has puzzled me is, how do they know at what specific time there was water and rain and so forth in Egypt? How did they determine that? Do you know?
Oh yeah, that's not too difficult. I mean, that's the science or the sub-discipline of geology called paleoclimatology, the study of ancient climates, and through all sorts of things, through analyzing the stratus, through looking at pollen counts, through looking at signs of water erosion, they can get a pretty good idea of when there was rain and when there wasn't rain. This has all been pretty well determined.
Right.
And in a nutshell, the Sahara forms somewhere around 10,000 BC, following the meltdown of the last ice age. That's another matter of considerable debate.
Indeed.
Somewhere around 11,500 or so BC, probably through some cataclysmic event, but still not proven, maybe an asteroid strike or something of the sort. The the huge ice sheet covering most of North America, anyway, Canada and half of America, starts melting. Siberia, which had been temperate, turns into tundra. The woolly mammoths and the rhinoceroses all die, and the whole Earth is in a state of chaos for a few thousand years. And when things simmer down a bit, then by this time the Sahara, which was fertile savanna, sort of like modern-day Kenya, has become desert, and there are a few rainy periods in between. From 7,000 to 5,000 BC, there are what's called the Nabtian pluvials, when it's rainier than it is now, but it's still not rainforest.
Right.
So, but this complicates the matter of trying to date the water weathering. Main point is that it is water weathering. The geologists are 100%, well, 98% in agreement. And if it's water weathering, it means that the Sphinx is, however it's dated, this is another big problem, actually dating it accurately.
Yeah.
But main thing is that it's a hell of a lot older than it's supposed to be, and it means that all of very ancient history has to be totally rewritten.
Right.
So Schwaller did not notice that was that important. So I picked up that cudgel. I mean, I realized that it was, and did all of my geology homework and wrote in Serpent in the Sky, the long last chapter, developing the theory of the water weathering, to which nobody paid any attention whatsoever. Not surprising when you know how things work in quackademia. And it took another 10 years before I finally found Robert Schoch, my astute geological colleague at Boston University, to come over with me, deeply skeptical initially, and gradually got convinced that the theory was absolutely correct. And eventually, something I hadn't noted myself earlier on, that the water weathering to the Sphinx is not floodwaters, which was the problem for me because, well, without going into why it would be difficult for it to be floodwaters, but rather lots and lots of rain falling down over long periods of time, coursing down the plateau and over the enclosure walls, and then falling directly on the Sphinx itself. So anyway, it took 10 years to find Schoch, and then eventually we did our presentation at what's sort of the World Cup of Geology, the Geological Society of America's annual meeting in 91, and then that generated, through another series of bizarre circumstances, the big NBC special with Charlton Heston, and then we were off and away. I mean, then it was world press and a lot of noise, and the noise still hasn't died down. But you see, this is not a question. Obviously, the redating of history is a very interesting. Obviously, it's an interesting academic debate, argument. But I mean, finally, sometimes people say, "Well, so what? Does it? It doesn't get back my shares of Bear Stearns, and it doesn't help me with my 401k. So what good is it?" Actually, what's good about it is, what's important about it really is that this whole debacle that we're in the middle of now is the result of an idea. And the idea is basically a materialistic philosophy, and the more you buy, the happier you are. And so we're stuck in this idiotic society, busy poisoning the earth with crazy people running around buying a lot of stuff they don't need. If suddenly the idea changes, the idea, let's say, reverts back to the sacred science of Egypt, that we as human beings are here for a very specific purpose, and woe betide us if we don't individually and collectively try to realize that purpose, then all of a sudden the age of the Sphinx makes a big difference. I mean, it's not just academic anymore. You might say it's the fulcrum upon which a whole worldview turns or could turn.
Mm-hmm.
And my own belief is that we're absolutely not going to get out of this chaos that we're in until or unless at least a number of people realize that the what I call the Church of Progress, the false church begun basically stemming out of the so-called French Enlightenment in the 18th century, which is enlightenment only if you think illumination depends upon electricity. Mm-hmm. This entire intellectual, philosophical paradigm has to be overthrown by not just the Sphinx itself, but by Schwaller's reformulation of the sacred science. So, in other words, a lot depends upon this. Is no longer a quibble just among academics, and the academics in their own way sort of recognize it, because we get a lot of flack out of this. An Air Force friend of mine says the flack is always heaviest when you're right over the target. So we get a lot of abuse out of this, which is fine. I mean, the level of abuse tells me how right we are.
Well, that's true. And I mean, you can't, again, we have big egos here, people who have been working on this kind of stuff for years and years. They have their degrees and their diplomas. They're not going to just roll over and die when some, newcomer comes along and tells everyone how it is, really, So.
That's right. Oh, yeah. I mean, this comes with the territory. And actually, if you're an outsider, I take it you are. I mean, what's your field? Do you have one, a field of study or a field of expertise?
Pretty much everything that I find out on the fringe, almost, if you will, of the alternative, sciences and history, and basically all of it that is of interest is things that primarily and mostly is not touched upon within the mainstream. So that's why we're here today, So
right,
yes.
Yeah. But in other words, you don't have anything to lose.
No.
So, because I wouldn't say it goes as far as compassion. I have very little compassion in me. But it's understandable why these people are so obdurate, no matter what the evidence is. In one sense, I like to say we're overturning the apple cart, and they make a living selling apples. Right. There's a story. Actually, I read it when I was a kid, but it's supposedly a true story. That really does explain it well. Because people always ask me, there's the evidence, there's the video, blah, blah, this geologists, why don't they agree? And there's a story concerning the great violinist, Jascha Heifetz. And apparently, it's not, it is, Heifetz. But at that, when Heifetz gave his Carnegie Hall debut, that's in the 40s somewhere, at the age of 11, in the audience were Misha Elman, who was the then reigning violin virtuoso, and his pal, the pianist Artur Rubinstein. And about halfway through the concert, Elman turned to Rubinstein and he said, "It's hot in here, isn't it?" And Rubinstein said, "Not for pianists." So with us, so for the Egyptologists and the archaeologists and the anthropologists and the historians, it's hot. But for the microbiologists and the geologists and the quantum physicists, they don't have a problem with this.
Yeah.
But it's not their field. So for the most part, they don't dive in saying, hey, we know what evidence looks like in our own field, and what these people are presenting is real evidence. So lighten up. They don't, and they won't.
Right.
And they won't. And they won't until they're obliged to do so, which is what most of my present work is devoted toward doing.
Yes.
Obliging, whether they like it or not.
And I guess also one of the advantages, if you will, of what it is that you're doing is that you can bring in a whole lot of different areas within your work. You can look at a wide variety of subjects in order to create your picture or your image, if you will, of ancient history. And in most cases, scientists overall are so compartmentalized. They are very specific into one area. And as you say, one might prove something on their own individual field, but they have not even looked up from their own desks in order to realize the bigger picture. You know what I mean?
But by and large, that's true, and they don't recognize that as a failing. To them, it's a virtue to be one-dimensional. So, yeah. So this is what we have to contend with, and for me, I mean, I'm on the outside to begin with, so I don't have anything to lose. I don't care, and
exactly.
And I'm invulnerable in that sense. I mean, yeah, they can make fun of they can hurl abuse, but I'm much better at hurling abuse back. So actually, I enjoy it when they're abusive.
A good fight, I guess.
Yeah, I like good fight. Absolutely, intellectual samurai. The bloodier it gets, the better I like it.
Well, I guess also that that has to take place in one regard. We can't expect that this should be without tears and I guess blood in that sense, because this is a battle of history, and many people would argue that the winners of the wars and the rulers of the societies, civilizations that we live in, those are the people who are also writing the history about the world, and that means that they have toppled previous civilizations in wars and in bloodshed, and in one regard, on the intellectual level, we need to do the same with these people, then, to expose them for the crimes that they've committed, and
exactly,
in that sense.
Exactly. I have a good line somewhere, I forget in which book, that academic malpractice should be called a crime, and if so, there wouldn't be any quackademics walking around loose.
Yeah.
But
and also, yeah, I guess we can mention that a lot of people, they are on their own specific field. They are being tutored now in history. They know what they've been taught, so to speak, and with a good heart, they're just there doing their work and think that they are doing
that's right,
the work of of truth, of course. So, but that can be very difficult in that position, and they don't have the full picture. And what you're doing here is to contribute to all of this in order to slowly turn this beast around and say, no, look over here. There's more. That's right. More stuff going on here.
What's more, they don't have the whole picture, and they don't want to have the whole picture. That's the main point. Actually, this is where the problem is, because they're satisfied, as you mentioned earlier. They've spent 20 and 30 years getting their doctorates, and here along comes somebody from out of left field, like myself and a number of colleagues, and say, no, you're completely wrong. You have to forget about everything that you ever thought.
Yes.
And they don't like this. And I can understand that, but at the same time, if that's how you feel, then just acknowledge that what you believe in is a religion, not science, and what you believe is what you believe, and what the church tells you, that's the dogma, and you go and parrot it and continue parroting it. But don't say that it's science and that it's based upon a rational, let's say, a study of the available evidence, because it isn't.
Right.
There's the evidence.
So I want to, before we kind of dive into some more of this, the deeper aspect to your work and the implications of your discoveries, and begin to look at the ancient Egyptians and what they were into, so to speak. I want to just go back to something you mentioned at the beginning here. You said that the current time that we're in right now, in regards to the ongoing meltdown and the disintegration of I don't know if we should call it just Western civilization. This is a global thing going on here right now. But you mentioned that it was right on cue. Are you going back to the ancient study of astrology when you say that, or do you have something more in mind when you say that this is right on cue?
Well, at the moment, probably your audience is thoroughly familiar with the Mayan prophecy of 2012.
Sure.
And this is the end of a world and the beginning of a new world. The interpretations differ.
Yeah.
But right on cue, for me, means that, I mean, I've seen it coming for a long time. I'm simply been amazed that it's gone on as long as it has. And at the moment. Yeah, I mean, and a few things saved it. Partly financial finagling, and partly the introduction of the amazing computer. So all of a sudden, there were things to keep the whole beast rolling along, instead of dying when it should have died somewhere around the time of the Vietnam War. Mm. But so it's on cue in that sense, and it's even more on cue. Actually, I'm working at the moment with a good friend of mine. It's a website people might want to look up, named Gerald Salente, who's a trends analysts, and we co-wrote, my name isn't on the cover for a variety of mutually agreeable reasons, a book back in the 90s called Trends 2000, where we, Jerry mainly, but with my sort of, I'm the philosophical, literary part of the combination, where we basically called all of this stuff, and now, and he really called it specifically. And if you go, people can pull up the website, which is www.trendsresearch.com, and get a good sense of where Jerry's coming from. So we're working together now because after people laughing at him or ignoring him for the last 10 years or so, suddenly he's right, and he's almost the only one who's been right about this whole debacle. And what we see coming on, it's what I saw coming on all along. Actually, I might say, I wrote a couple of little plays back in 1960 that have been done a couple of times that are, now that I look at them, I mean, they're not just satires, they're practically prophecies. And in one of these plays, I have a sort of the ultimate businessman. He's a consultant's consultant, where when the consultants don't know the answer, that's who they go to. And he's suddenly stuck, and he doesn't know either. And the phones keep ringing in this little one-act play. It's General Motors, and then it's Exxon, and then it's so on, and they all have a question, what do we do next? And he doesn't know. So, I mean, I was right. The whole play is about a boy who finds the phoenix, and the phoenix burns and then doesn't rise. So I was onto this 50 years ago, and actually it's time to sort of upgrade that play a little bit and see if I can get it out there and get people to produce it. But really, so it's right on schedule in that sense. And Jerry isn't that much into the philosophical side, as not as much into it as I am. But even without the 2012 prophecy, the timing is about right. I mean, what's happening now is that this whole thing is unraveling, and it is not going to go back to what the economists call normal. Normal being the lunatic materialist society that's in the process of crumbling. So it is right on schedule. What is to come out of it? We don't know. We hope that it will be a genuine renaissance in which the old, ancient, sacred science is revivified and resuscitated in a form commensurate to, let's say, the demands of a new and technological age. I don't think we're going to have to get rid of our computers, to tell you the truth. But
right.
But the principles upon which the sacred science was formulated are eternal. And I might say, because we haven't mentioned this before, I regularly most of my income comes from, such as it is, comes from leading intensive study tours to Egypt.
Yes.
And it's in Egypt. I mean, the main thing of that Egypt experience is that after a couple of weeks in Egypt, you really do understand what civilization once was like. And I mean, then it gets complicated because Egypt was at its high point, very close to its beginning, and degenerated over time, ultimately ending up in Greece, which is a much later and much lesser civilization, and then Rome, which isn't a civilization at all. It's basically a three-ring circus. And
why do you think it slowly deteriorated? Or are we then in the same position as they were in that sense, that we're also letting things go? It's slipping out of our hands, so to speak?
Well, this gets into the very interesting question of cycles, which of course is what that 2012 prophecy is all about.
Yes.
Now we go back over to India and the Yuga cycle, where there's a golden age. Plato talks about this too, a golden age, a silver age, a bronze age, a dark or an iron age, and then it starts going up again from that. So here's the big arguments. I mean, very interesting. Lots of scholars are working on this from a number of different points of view, and so far, nobody, I don't think anybody, me included, has a definitive answer for it. So in other words, where are we in the cycle? Maybe the best, I love using analogies. So it's sort of like that it's very difficult to judge from our human point of view what other civilizations were like. This is why Egypt is so interesting, because there it is. You walk through it, and I mean, if your mind isn't blown by this incredible stuff, there's something seriously wrong with you, because you get a sense of what had been and what was lost. But it's lost because of a of a natural cycle of time, probably connected to the precession of the equinoxes. And as I said, this gets complicated. We could go 2 hours just on the question of precession.
Indeed.
But just to use an analogy, for example, you imagine a conscious and sentient creature that lives for just a minute. If that minute happens to fall at midnight and it's raining, the view that creature has of what life is all about will be totally different from a minute at high noon in Southern California, right?
Yes.
So then you go the next step up the hierarchy, let's say the cycle of the seasons, and you have a sentient creature that lives for a day. Well, if that day is in the middle of January and it's still raining, well, both of these characters seem to live in Wales, then it can have absolutely no idea of what a day in June in Southern California would actually be like, unless some kind of memory of that has percolated down through myth and legend, at which point our day person might simply say, well, that's a bunch of nonsense. That's just fantasy. What life is really like is raining in the middle of Wales in January, and we call it progress.
So you're talking about that our perspective is very limited, right? We get this short lifespan amount of time, and we basically can't look outside that, you know?
Exactly. I mean, we have our 80 years or our 90 or 100 years, and that's a day. That's more or less, let's say, roughly equivalent to a day within the 365-day yearly cycle. So we really can't get it, and the only way we can get it is, well, in part through study, in part through access to, you know, some of the glorious architecture and art and music that's come down to us over the years. And of course, you get it in Egypt, more so than any place else, because even though other civilizations certainly had the same doctrine in their own form and constructed accordingly, there's almost nothing left. In other words, you go to China, you go to India, there's virtually nothing there from, say, 2500, 3000 BC.
I mean, they say that in Egypt, they say that there are pyramids. For instance, we don't have to digress and go into that all now, but there is some evidence and researchers that are pointing to the fact that there even are pyramids in China. Have you heard about that?
Oh, there are. Oh, sure.
Right.
Shaka's seen those. Sort of mysterious. I mean, they're more like, I don't think they're stone constructed. I think they're earth, but they're definitely pyramids.
Yeah.
And access to them is difficult. I don't know. I don't think anybody knows when they were built or why they were built. Schoch actually has written a couple of good books called, by the way, his name is Schoch, Robert Schoch, Schoch, called Voyages of the Pyramid Builders, and another one called Secret of the Stones, looking into the whole catastrophe theory and this strange phenomenon of pyramids all around the world.
Yes.
There they are, the ziggurats of Babylon, of Mesopotamia, and the much later pyramids of Mesoamerica. And yes, there they are in China. They're all over the place. But strange places.
But they're very well preserved in Egypt. That is a fact. I mean, do you think that has to do with the climate, that there isn't any rain, there isn't any severe weathering going on down there right now, except from the sun and the blowing sand, of course? But
mainly that. Plus, Egypt had and has, well, it doesn't have any more because you can fly over it and bomb it. But until relatively recently, Egypt was as secure as any civilization on Earth, bounded on three sides by practically impenetrable desert, and on the north by the swamps their own swamps to the north, and the Mediterranean Sea. So it was very difficult to invade it and conquer it. And at the same time, Egypt was blessed in another way, in that the food jumped out of the ground. I mean, nowadays they've got 70 million people in an area that should only support 25 million, so they've got big problems. But in ancient Egyptian days, along came the floods. The floods covered the land for 4 months of the year. Nobody had anything to do. Sit around, no television. Sort of New Kingdom television was a bust. And so there they were, a populous, rich country with nothing to do but honor the gods, who, by the way, should not be understood as superstitious figments of the imagination, but rather as the embodiments or the materializations of cosmic and organic principles. Then the whole thing becomes understood as a science and not as a primitive religion. Oh. So this combination of factors made Egypt absolutely unique, and so there it is, all there for us to, as I said, we can really viscerally understand what a civilization was like by visiting Egypt, and it's almost the only place on earth where you can get that same hit.
Yes.
I often compare. Actually, I say that Egypt is like sex. You can read all about it from now till doomsday, and even look at pictures, but until you've experienced it, you don't know what it's about.
Right. That's interesting. Now, how often are you like? Are you down there like once a year, many times a year?
Oh,
or
more. 3 or 4 times a year. The combination, as you might expect, the combination of financial meltdown. Plus, especially for the Americans who are, in case you haven't noticed. Have you been to America?
No, I have not been, actually. I'm hoping to go there pretty soon, but we'll see how the climate is at that point,
Well, your English is brilliant, considering you've never been here. Anyway, America is not, in fact, the home of the free, nor is it, or the land of the free, nor is it the home of the brave. I mean, Americans are geographically challenged. They don't know the difference between Giza and Gaza. So they think, they're afraid, or a lot of them are afraid to go to Egypt. So the combination of economic meltdown plus, people come on my trips from all over the world, but sure. I'm American and my base is here, so more people tend to come from America than elsewhere.
Right. Okay.
So it's there. The trips are fairly underpopulated these days, unfortunately. But and who knows what's going to happen in the Middle East? But at the moment, Egypt is still okay.
Yes.
So anyway, so I do the trips.
And this. To return a little bit to your friend Gerald Celente there you mentioned,
yes.
On one regard we can also say that he's been credited, if you will, for these forecasts of like looking into the Soviet when that right. When the economic system of the Soviet Union collapsed and so forth. So he knows what is going on here. Yet at the same time, when he's doing these kinds of forecasts, I wonder also if that actually helped to spur things even further along and to make people more afraid if they come and look to this guy for like more evidence or what's going on. Let's see what Celente have to say. So my question is, do you think that this helps to spur along the economic apocalypse, if you will, by the type of...
No, I don't actually. In fact, the opposite. Jerry and I are both, we feel that the whole system is dying and dead and good riddance to it, but that the possibility for a renaissance is really there. And it better be there or everybody's cooked. But no, it's the opposite. It's like you go to a doctor and he says, gee, I'm sorry, you're dying of terminal cancer. You say, well, you shouldn't tell us that. Now I really will die. What, do you want to know or don't you want to know? Right. And if you do know, maybe you can take steps. Maybe you can look for other things that will help.
That's true.
But no, the opposite. And apart from that, it's not as though, Jerry's getting a lot. He's getting a lot of press these days. And as I said, between us, we've been about 95% right. So there's really high time some people started sitting up and listening. But no, he has all sorts of, or he mainly, but both of us have all sorts of strategies where people who are aware of what's going on can at least take certain measures to not go, as Jerry says, good line, not go down with the status quo.
Yeah.
It's crucial. You have to know, if you don't know what's going on around you and what, in broad terms, what to expect, you're helpless. It's like, it's like knowing somebody says, well, you better get a nice warm goose down coat because winter's coming up. And you say, oh, don't scare me. I don't like it when it's cold.
Of course. Well, you're absolutely right. It's about looking at reality and what is happening in the world. And at the same time, I also feel that this is, from my point of view, if you follow the more conspiratorial view of all of this. I also see that there is a reformation, an economic reformation, if you will, going on in the world, with all of this stuff going on about the will, if you will, from the people on the top to bring in a more centralized economic system. For instance, in Europe here we have the euro, and over there it's talk about the Amero, for instance.
The Amero, Amero, all of this stuff. Yeah, I'm very difficult with so-called conspiracy theories. I mean, it's a conspiracy theory if it happens not to be your reality. But yes, there's the Trilateral Commission, and there are the Bilderbergs, and there's 9/11. If anybody thinks 19 guys with box cutters brought that thing down by themselves, they're out of their minds.
Yes.
Yes, all of this stuff is going on. However, the deep conspiracists, well, if you go really deep into David Icke and guys like that, then it's sort of aliens, reptilians who are doing it and all of that.
Sure.
Icke's a smart guy, actually, but I don't go along with him on that. He's a very interesting character.
He is, yes.
But at what level the conspiracy plugs in, and of course is a big thing I'm sure you're familiar with, is just by the nature of the questions that you pose of the Illuminati.
Sure.
But that whole theory presupposes that they know what they're doing,
of course,
and can manifest it. I tend to call them, I think these are the idiots who don't know what they're doing, and they're caught up in it now too. I call them the unilluminati.
Yes.
And even they, no matter what they do, they are helpless against organized public protest. And actually, this is part of Jerry, we're doing this thing, we're getting at the Trends Journal right now, that he's forecast what's coming up. I mean, he forecast what he called the panic of '08, which is giving way, and it's already here, actually, the crash of '09.
Yeah.
And this is not a global recession. This is a depression. This is the worst depression, worse than the Great Depression, actually, in the 30s, because it's global, and it will manifest in somewhat different ways, but it's inescapable. And you already see, and this will lead, because what will happen then, the big guys get bailed out, what they call the too big to fail, the hell with the too small to save. But the too small to save are very numerous. And we already see, just in the last week or two, Jerry's been forecasting that sooner or later this is going to end up in a revolution. Now, we have a chapter, the book that we're planning, called Off With Their Heads. Now, whether or not they bring back the guillotine is hard to say, but there are a lot of angry people out there. And just now you might have read that a whole bunch of workers did a sit-in strike in a plant in Illinois saying, we're not leaving, you can't fire us, we want our vacation pay and our benefits and all of this stuff.
Sure.
And Obama actually backed them up. Well, this is what's going to happen. So no matter it's actually, you might say, it's a crapshoot. Will the powers that are trying to take total financial control of the entire globe be successful at it, or will they be stopped by maybe not necessarily mass organized opposition, but by an awful lot of opposition, maybe not necessarily organized, but enough to bring them down and to prevent their plans from coming through. Because otherwise, if they're successful, then it's not just it's a return to slavery, except it's not a slave state or a slave country; it's a slave globe.
Planet, yes.
But the hope is, and again, strangely enough, we've kind of gone way off course here, but strangely enough, this is where Egypt and the sacred science actually comes in, because it's one thing to realize that we live in a madhouse and that this whole materialist, stupid, rationalist society is a catastrophe, but it's quite another to understand that there is an antidote to it. That's the main thing. So if you know what you're supposed to do with your life and you take measures to do it, then you're active. Otherwise, you just sit there and complain. And, a friend of mine, I'm not sure if it's Gandhi's statement, or there's a friend of mine who studied not with Gandhi himself, but with one of his chief disciples, who said, it's better to light one candle than curse the darkness.
Yeah.
Maybe so. I'm not so sure of that. In fact, sometimes cursing the darkness lets other people know that even though they're blinded by the electric lights, it's a pretty dark age. But
that's a good analogy. And
yeah.
John, why don't we can begin to kind of round things off here on the first segment, and we continue talking about in the next segment about this. I guess what you would refer to then as the kind of the antidote to this, and we can talk about the ancient Egyptians and why their knowledge, if you will, is important and something that potentially can help us here in I guess the coming turbulent time that we're entering into here right now. But I do want you to mention your website, of course, but also some of your titles of your books, and tell us also about your fantastic DVD, the series Magical Egypt as well.
Well, the books, you mentioned the books. It's Serpent in the Sky, The High Wisdom of Ancient Egypt, which is an in-depth introduction to Schwaller de Lubitz's work. Schwaller is now in English, but Schwaller is a very difficult writer. So French, English, doesn't matter what language it's in. It's not an easy read. For those who really have a passion for it, you just take a couple of years off your life and bring Schwaller home. And it's easy in Sweden because it's dark all winter long. There's nothing else to do. and read Schwaller, but it's The Serpent in the Sky. And then there's the astrology book, but that's now out of print. I'm hoping to get it back in print somewhere along the line, The Case for Astrology. And then there's The Traveler's Key to Ancient Egypt, which is a guidebook to Egypt seen through symbolist eyes. And then there's the DVD series, which we're very proud of, but it doesn't make any money, unfortunately, organized by my genius friend Chance Gardner, because I gather you've seen that.
Yes.
And the graphics, I mean, Chance is absolutely brilliant, and on a absolutely shoestring budget put out this extraordinary 8-part series. Maybe we'll be adding other parts to it, but we're very pleased with that. I mean, if you can't get to Egypt, that's probably as good a way to acquaint yourself with the symbolist interpretation, as that's what it's called, by the way. I don't think I mentioned that earlier. By both detractors and adherents, Schwaller's interpretation is called the symbolist interpretation. And from the series, and then of course there's The Mystery of the Sphinx, the Charlton Heston DVD about the water weathering to the Sphinx, and that's basically it. Apart from the earlier stuff, which I had the money, I'd republish myself, the book of short stories and the novel and the plays and the screenplays, but they're just sitting there and inaccessible. But the Egypt books are there, and people want, they can, the series or the books, they can order them from me, or I guess you can get some of them you can get on Amazon, but they're available, readily available. And of course the trips, anybody listening in who wants to come on a trip, the next trip is February. I've got just enough people to make it go, but I could sure use a few more people. Actually, on that trip, oddly enough, that's a different trip. That's a dedicated trip. I have a trip coming up in January, but it's for a study group, and about half that group are Norwegians, actually. But that's not open to the public.
Right.
Besides, the Swedes and the Norwegians always fight anyway, don't they? So.
Yeah, we do. Yeah.
Not much. Anyway, so yeah, if you want to,
February, you mentioned, and can people find more information about that on your website?
Yeah. On the website, then you click on Magical Egypt Tours, and there's the itinerary, and there's, it explains everything and the prices and all the rest of it. So anybody interested, give me an email, write me, and jump on.
Okay, tell us, John Anthony, about your podcast. You also had a podcast where people can go and listen to some of the work and the research that you're doing. Tell us about that.
Thanks, Henrik. Yes, well, I started this about a year ago, and I put new ones up in my own inefficient way, much less often than I intended to, but they go up there. I think there are 8 of them up to now. They're called Phoenix Fire. They're podcasts. They're roughly an hour long. And it's me going in depth into things that either would go in depth into a book or perhaps into a video or something of the sort, but I have much more time. I'm at my own leisure, as it were, on my own recognizance, so I can ramble on in my digressive way about various subjects. So anybody interested in the whole oeuvre can just pull those things up, and you can download them and listen to them in your car if you're stuck in traffic or something like that. And there's another one that'll be coming up pretty soon, whoever pulls them up, you'll see the titles. The next one planned is called the Four Cowboys of Apocalypse 2.0, which should be an interesting one, because the four cowboys, people are probably familiar with the four horsemen of the apocalypse from Revelation: war, famine, pestilence, and death. I'll be discussing those, actually. They're a rather peculiar choice with the four horsemen. But the four cowboys have everybody, or have most people, shall we say, seduced into thinking that they're the good guys because they wear white hats and they go riding across the prairie. But the four cowboys of Apocalypse 2.0 are capitalism, patriotism, democracy, and technology. And they are, in fact, underlying the debacle that we're entering into now, but in rather complex and interesting ways. And that's what I'll be talking about in the next podcast. Yes, it absolutely must crash. It can't. There is no getting back to normal, and since normal is a lunatic asylum, nobody in their right mind, if there are any such people, would even want to go back to it. The problem, of course, is in what way, if at all possible, can the damage be minimized? And this is another matter altogether. There are steps that individuals can take, but a lot of people are going to be hurting out of this thing. I mean, globally, this is a disaster, and I mean, people, even if they'd like to buy more of the rubbish that they've been buying in Walmart all of these years, don't have the money to do it, and they don't have jobs. And the jobs, I mean, if you follow this stuff, I mean, no day goes by when there's not some other giant company laying off 10 or 15 or 50,000 workers. You got 50,000 workers laid off. You've got 50,000 people who are making livings no longer having livings. I mean, this is a disaster. And you listen, I mean, again, as I said, if you follow this stuff, the people who didn't see it coming, the ones that Obama brought in to solve the situation, are now telling us what to do and when it's going to be over. They haven't a clue when it's going to be over. If they had a clue, they wouldn't have made it happen in the first place. And it's not as though there weren't any warnings that, oh, well, everybody thought this was the wise thing to do. Lots of people didn't think it was the wise thing to do, me included. Yeah. But who listened to us? So now the debacle is upon us, and exactly the manner in which it unfolds and rolls out, nobody, I mean, absolutely nobody really knows. Just all you can say is that it is not going to be pretty. And as I said, we're forecasting that there really are going to be revolutions here and there, but out of it, at some point or another, maybe people will start coming to their senses, and this is where Egypt comes in again, because Egypt stands as a model, not as an exact model. In other words, we're not going to build pyramids again and temples of Luxor and mummify our pharaohs, but the principles, let's say the doctrine of immortality that Egypt is based upon, and that in rather corrupted form trickles down into Christianity, and is mirrored also in somewhat not really corrupted form, but by the religions of the East, and Buddhism and Hinduism and Zen and all of those Eastern doctrines, is basically the same doctrine. And this is what we're here for, individually and collectively. And if a bunch of us don't try to put these ideas into operation, and that doesn't mean just reading about them and thinking about them. It means it's a certain kind of discipline. And I mean, it can be had in various places. You have to be careful, because a lot of it is just blabber and talk. But if we don't do that, we're cooked. And I mean that individually and collectively. And one of the advantages, you might say, if you call it advantage, maybe that's the wrong word, but one of the possibilities inherent in this collapse is that it will force people to start asking questions that they have not been asking before. Not all of people, no. A lot of them will go down with the Titanic, but a lot of people, and again, this is I like working with analogies, and as far as I'm concerned, there there are really only three ways to learn lessons. Two practical ways. The first way is the hard way. And that is, let's say you want to be a professional baseball player or a concert class violinist. So you make that decision, and every ounce of your energy goes into perfecting, into mastering those, one a sport and the other an art. And that's the hard way. It's a tremendous amount of work, but there's a joy to it. The second way is the harder way. That's if you're a drug addict or an alcoholic and you deny that there's a problem until you're absolutely in the gutter at death's door. And then you're confronted with just one choice. Are you going to give up the drug or the alcohol and live, or are you going to keep drinking, deny that you've got a problem, and die? That's the harder way. Yeah. That's Western civilization. It is a drug addict. It is an alcoholic. And it is now on its back in the gutter at death's door, and it's an individual as well as a collective thing to say, well, I don't want to do this. I really don't want to die. And then there's the third way, which is the grace of God, which I actually believe in, but I don't count on it.
Okay, yeah.
So to learn lessons.
John, do you think that there is I don't know if we should call it then God or nature or some kind of overarching consciousness here that is in some way involved in human development, and that at this point is saying, no, this is not the way to go down? What I'm referring to is there some kind of judge here, referee here, who's saying this is not the way to go about it? Or why are things kind of crumbling? Is this a psychological issue going on here? What do you think?
Well, it's crumbling because it's time for it to crumble, to go back to that yuga cycle. Is there anybody overseeing winter? When winter hits, everything dies and goes underground, and the seeds sprout under, and gradually in March or April or so, it'll warm up and things will start sprouting again. But winter is winter. And where we are now, we are at some point indefinable. I don't know. We're in the middle, let's say the equivalent of the middle of January, or maybe we're somewhere in February. There are certain hopeful signs, you might say. One of the things, actually the only hopeful sign that I can see for myself, major hopeful sign, is that, that's complicated, but if you go back, you might say that the low point for Western civilization, less so in the East, but even there was the downfall of the Roman Empire in the Dark Ages, which were really pretty dark, 6th and 7th and 8th and 9th centuries BC in Europe. And the Western world were pretty bad. Actually, Islam not so bad. Once Islam took hold, it was the beacon of civilization in the 9th and 10th centuries, especially in Spain and Baghdad and places like that.
Yes.
But how shall I say, where we are, so it's been coming out of that low point from, let's say, 900 or so AD. And what we've seen in the last couple of hundred years is, of course, this astounding but mindless and, for the most part, destructive technology. But that, the genesis of that has been this tremendous flowering of creativity. Unfortunately, most of it directed toward destructive means, weapons of mass destruction, and biochem warfare, and GM, genetically modified plants. I mean, all of this horrors, the Frankenfoods, the stuff that we're beset with. But that creativity itself is, at least in theory, neutral. If all of that energy were suddenly, or at least a lot of that energy was suddenly turned toward things that are genuinely soul-nourishing and heart-warming, things could change in a hurry, quickly.
Yeah.
There's a marvelous line quoted all over the place. I don't know, you probably know it, but Victor Hugo's line that there's one thing stronger than all the armies in the world, and that is an idea whose time has come.
Right, yes.
You know that line?
Yeah.
Well, a couple of sort of thoughts about that line. Good Victorian that he was, Hugo, basically, you reading into it, it sort of assumed that the new idea whose time has come is a good idea, but it could just as well be a bad idea. I mean,
That's true.
Hitler is a bad idea.
Yeah.
And yet his time came.
Yeah.
And so, and the second thing is that the second strongest thing in the world is an idea whose time has not yet gone. So this is when we find all of these blowhards who now have cabinet positions again, talking about returning to normal being the lunatic asylum.
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, always the throwback, if you will, to all of this could potentially be that this gives, just as the first, not the first, obviously, but the last Great Depression in the 30s had, of course, that gave way to some new form of dictator which come in with certainty and again kind of instills that into people that yes, we will bring the old order back, and now things will be structured again, never more we're going to come into this. So there is a danger as well as a potential here at the same time. That's what I'm seeing.
There is a very real danger, you bet there is. And I mean, yes, you go back into history. I mean, Hitler was not an accident. I mean, the whole thing was set up by the British and the French to make sure that the Germans stayed impoverished. And along came Hitler, and let's face it, half of corporate America was all on Hitler's side because the alternative to them, socialism. My goodness, they'll take away our money. So yeah, this is a very, very real danger. But at the same time, the possibility of a renaissance actually is there, but it depends. I keep repeating this, individually and collectively. And to go back to the question that you asked before, is there, let's say, an overriding consciousness that looks after us? I don't know. What there isn't is somebody with a big gray beard pointing a finger and saying, now everybody's going to be enlightened. I mean, there's a whole new age stuff going on out there. I get this across my website. I get all of this information as well. Who think that suddenly the clock will strike 2012 and we'll all be brothers again.
Yeah, right.
And I don't believe anything of that sort for for 2 seconds. But when the climate changes, I mean, just as it's very difficult. And you have to go to a lot of effort to grow roses in January. But in June, it's easy. So when the times change, I mean, I really do believe that the Hindus before them, in the Vedas, knew what they were talking about with their yuga cycle, that there is this slowly turning cycle, and that when it's winter, and when spring comes, the possibilities that were not there, even just a few weeks earlier, all of a sudden there are those possibilities.
Yes.
And the plant, actually somewhere on my website there's a little essay on civilization and comparing it to a park. And when the park gets degenerate, I mean, let's say that the Western, the great religions are the trees in that park, and when they and the park keepers are supposed to be the priests and the poets and the scientists and the philosophers. But if they're all drunk or crazy, the park falls into disarray and everything becomes poison ivy and brambles, and the seeds sprout, but they can be trampled into the ground by any wandering jackass. And so it's a situation with a lot of potential, but it doesn't just happen automatically. Somebody's got to tend the seeds, and somebody's got to make them grow, and somebody's got to keep the wandering jackasses off from the land, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, yes, in other words, there's a higher consciousness. I mean, with the entire fabric of the universe is nothing but consciousness, and this is the sacred science. And the Egyptians understood it very well, and so did all of the other doctrines. Even though, trying to defend, institutionalized religion is a bit like the ACLU. That is the American Civil Liberties Union, being honor bound to defend criminals and murderers who nevertheless have not been afforded their rights under the law. So with the religions, now, I don't know if you follow this argument at all, the Darwinian argument with these two jackasses Dawkins and Dennett.
Oh, Dawkins, yeah, yeah, sure.
These guys, him and Dennett. These are the co-commandants of the latter-day Darwin Jugend.
Yeah, the new bulldogs of Darwin. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. These are the pit bulls of the Darwinian pit bulls. So they're all, rampaging about religion. And let's face it, there's almost nothing that particularly the Western churches can be accused of that they're not guilty of. At the same time, they built the cathedrals of Chartres and the wonderful churches of Italy and so on. And I mean, if this stuff is all delusion and superstition, it means that Bach and Beethoven and Monteverdi and all of the people who wrote all of that glorious music are deluded. They just happen to be talented geniuses, but they don't know what they're talking about. On the other hand, the guys who invented chemical warfare and Walmarts and Disneyland, they know what they're talking about.
Right, yeah.
So,
and the atomic bomb and all that, yeah, sure.
All this horrific stuff. And actually underlying this is coming up in a Phoenix Fire somewhere along, because underlying the Church of Progress, this absolutely malevolent superstition that infects the entire Western world and now the rest of the world entirely, actually its underpinning is nothing but Darwinian evolution, the notion that that we're accidental creations, not even creations is the wrong word, we're accidental accretions in an equally accidental universe, which by definition means that there is no purpose to our existence. So, in fact, all of the lunatic materialism and commercialism and all of this junk that's going on has its intellectual or philosophical support, such as it is, in Darwinian evolution, which is, as far as I'm concerned, the cargo cult of the West. It's the most malevolent superstition ever to infect the human mind. But that's subject for another Phoenix Fire blog along the line.
Very interesting. So let's kind of dive into it a little bit here and talk about a little bit of the science of the Egyptians and the doctrine of immortality, as you mentioned before. And I guess we can preface that by saying or asking that question that you posed at the beginning, that basically simply was that, why should I look at this? Why is this even important to me, who's living, in this age and at this time with our particular problems? What would you say to that type of statement or question?
Well, almost nobody is immune from, let's say, from their own humanity. I should say some people are. George W. Bush is, but and a whole bunch of the people that are there in Washington seem to be immune to it. But other people ask questions. I mean, we don't, with the Darwinian doctrine, I mean, lots of people just live their lives and don't give it a second thought. If you actually give it a second thought, it's not easy to emotionally, intellectually you can do it, but emotionally accept that your own life is completely meaningless. People don't do that easily. And if you do accept it and you're honest, you become a French existentialist. The existentialists ask, they accepted stupid Darwin at his word. And their question was, well, since life is meaningless, why not commit suicide? And they thought of a whole bunch of reasons. One, it's uncomfortable, and two, you don't like to. But basically, they were honest enough to ask this question. There is, unfortunately, I don't have it somewhere. I read it off in one of my Phoenix Fire blogs. A wonderful statement, eloquent statement by Bertrand Russell about accepting the meaninglessness of life. And it's quite brilliantly written. But if that's what life is about, well, you got to accept it and you got to live it. But if you don't feel that way, and most people don't, I mean, really, horrible as the Western churches have been for 2,000 years, they wouldn't have existed if they were nothing but superstition and stupidity. They continued, they lived for all of its terrible excesses because there was enough of it there, there was enough of a seed of it there, somehow or another. Enough people who actually were practicing Christians, probably it's not even 1%, but enough people who actually lived the doctrine to to inspire or to let the others know that there really is or was something there to begin with. So, it's that sense of, I hate to use these words spiritual because they're so Baudelarized by New Age goofballs.
Right.
But without that spiritual, without that sense that we're here for a reason, and then not just the intellectual conviction, but the necessity of leading your life in such a way that you're doing your best to realize what that meaning is. This is in the Bible when Jesus says, "Let the dead bury the dead." That's what he's talking about, the dead people. They're walking around, but they're dead.
Of course, yes.
Dead are the spiritually unaware. And for them, they live their lives, people live their lives, and that's how they live them. But for others, understanding what's involved, and the Egyptians certainly understood it full well. I mean, even the quackademics acknowledge that the entire civilization it's a one-issue civilization, which is the immortality, dedicated to the immortality of the soul. Of course, the quackademics say, wink, wink, nod, nod, we know better. But if that's taken seriously, it means, somebody once described golf as a very simple game that's very difficult to play. And the legitimate path is a bit like that. It's easy to put it into words, few words. I mean, this is what the purpose of life is, to arrive at a level of consciousness that we don't normally have access to, but that many of us, most of us maybe even, especially in childhood, do access, and make that state of consciousness as permanent as possible, or at least have flashes of it often enough so that we know that we're leading our lives constructively rather than destructively. And in Egypt, this was the motivating force of the entire civilization. Everybody, whether it was, you can be sure the priests, the high priests and the architects and the great artists and the pharaohs knew what they were doing, and other people didn't know, but life was orchestrated in such a way that they were in positions where what they were doing in their daily lives was fundamentally creative. This is something that is virtually gone now. Earlier, where was it? Was it on where we were recording it? When we were talking about creativity as the one possible saving grace to get us out of this cataclysm. In fact, even in medieval times, which nobody in their right mind would want to go back to medieval times, with a brutal church and an even more brutal aristocracy in charge. But what people did with their daily lives was fundamentally creative. In other words, if you're a carpenter, or a cooper, or whatever it was that you were doing, had an element of creativity to it. Being a good peasant is creative. I lived in Spain all those years. Believe me, they were okay. They were tenant farmers, and they didn't have much money, but they worked hard. But their lives themselves were expended in activities that were fundamentally creative.
Yes.
With us in our technological society, it's exactly the opposite. Almost nobody gets an opportunity to make a living out of his or her creative faculties.
Sure.
And those that do, 90% of them expend it in stupid stuff. It's very creative. It's creative to create nerve gas, but I don't know if the guy who invents nerve gas comes home and says to his wife, "Whoa, we could kill millions of them with what I did today." I don't know if they really feel proud of themselves for that.
Well, some might do, unfortunately, but yeah.
They probably do, yeah. Well, and the rationale is, well, if I don't invent nerve gas, the other guys over in Russia, they'll invent it. That's right.
Yeah.
So, but the Egyptian doctrine is entirely devoted to that process of acquiring that higher level of consciousness. There's a marvelous line, and it's a Neoplatonic set of essays called the Hermetica. Are you familiar with that?
Yes, indeed, I am. Yeah.
That wonderful line in the Asclepius, as it's called, where Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes the thrice great, who is the Greekified
Hermes
version of Jehuti, Hermes of the Egyptian Jehuti, the principle of cosmic wisdom, is talking to his disciple Asclepius and about the soul. As for the soul, and the belief that it is immortal by nature, or, as I have taught you, may strive to become so, all this they will mock at and even convince themselves that it is false. But the key word to that line is strive to become so. That's what Egypt is actually all about. And because it is deeply hierarchical society, and we really don't know what the teaching methods were like or anything of the sort, but we can see the results in that fabulous art and architecture that you walk into. And the reason that works, I mean, all great sacred art is around the world, the cathedrals of Europe and the mosques of Islam and the temples of India, all embody the knowledge, the same kind of knowledge that the Egyptians had, but the Egyptians manifested it on a magnitude that nobody else has approached, and also with a subtlety that nobody else can quite equal. And what's involved there is that the so-called gods that are snickered at by the quackademics are, as I said earlier, embodiments of cosmic principles. Those principles are each, for reasons too complicated to go into in our radio talk here, associated with specific numbers which give rise to specific geometries, harmonies, and proportions. So when these are incorporated into a religious structure, a spiritual structure, by people who know what they're doing, what happens is that it communicates literally through music, stone music. It's the same, it's vibrational, the same as music is vibrational.
Yes.
But when you walk into one of those Egyptian temples, what happens is that, and they're all consecrated to different principles and different triads of gods and so on. So, but when you walk into them, you're affected. I mean, your inner nature, your emotional faculties have evoked, the principle itself is evoked within you. So when you walk into an Amun temple, especially the way we do it, which is when nobody else is there, whenever humanly possible, because I go to a lot of great lengths to avoid the crowds and be there at special times.
Yes.
And when you walk in there, suddenly, you realize that you've been buffaloed, you've been conned all your life to thinking that what we have is progress, but also you actually you get the hit from that great religious architecture of the principle to which it is concentrated. So, it's a transformational experience.
So did you experience, let's say, the first time you were down there and visited one of the temples, one of the sites, and looked at this or experienced it for yourself? Was that a spiritual / religious experience for you?
Oh, absolutely. But I mean, I'd had a few of them before. I mean, that led me to that. But as I said, I knew it at age 13 that I'd been born into a lunatic asylum, but gradually over time, there were a few sort of moments of epiphany, as it were. One was, we didn't have any classical music in my house. To my parents, they were nice people, but to them, Rodgers and Hammerstein was classical music, and I only became acquainted with classical music when I was 18 or 19 or thereabouts. And I remember one time, I forget exactly how it was or where it was, but all of a sudden there were the Beethoven late quartets playing, and particularly the quartet in C sharp minor, and that suddenly told me, not everybody is crazy. And then not long after that, I was in the army. Needless to say, I did not join, but they stuck me in the army. And I was over in Germany after the war, of course. This is 53 or 54.
Okay.
And I drove down into France and went to the Cathedral of Chartres.
Yes.
It was a November morning, all by myself, no tourists there at the time or anything. And that said, well, whatever is wrong with the horrible religion, which is a lot. Some geniuses who knew something that I do not know did this. So that was one of those moments. And then it took some more years before I actually put two and two together and started actually pursuing that knowledge. Mostly, as I said, I was writing my novels and plays, and very satirical. And as I said, not bad for young work. If I had the money, I'd put them out again. But
Yes.
and then when I finally got into Egypt, yes, then I knew what I was after. Then I was directed, and the first time I went to Egypt, I'd already done my 5 years of work in the library studying Schwaller, so I was prepared for it. Mm-hmm. And yes, it was very much that kind of experience. It was that realization, as I've repeated, I hope not as ad nauseum on our show here.
But, John, I want to ask you here then about
sure.
The idea that there must be something within ourselves that resonate, that makes these experiences. We resonate with this particular architecture. For instance, if we talk about that I would probably at this point in time define it that it's something within our psyche. It's almost an archetypal thing, if you want to get psychological about it. But what do you think it is that makes us resonate with these particular geometries or tones or shapes or ratios?
Well, sure. No, you're exactly right, Henrik. Of course, because we're the same ratios. In other words, Schwaller called his doctrine, actually the sacred science of Egypt, he called it the anthropocosm. In other words, the man cosmos. Mm-hmm. And Plato says, the man know thyself. This is what he's talking about. In other words, everything that went into the universe is in us. We resonate to universal principles. But the universal principles, we get it in nature. It's not too difficult. We can never find any nature anywhere left. But we get it. But when it's orchestrated by great geniuses into the sacred art and architecture, then we get it in a concentrated dose. There's no missing it. And at least, again, it does not apply to everyone. For the academics who are, I like to describe them as the emotionally defective and the spiritually dyslexic, they don't get it, but everyone else does. And so once you've experienced it for yourself, then you know. Until then, you can read about it, and it sounds nice. I said earlier that Egypt is like sex. Until you've experienced it, you really don't have an idea of what it's like. Right. But there you actually get it. And of course, you get it elsewhere too. You get it in the great mosques, and you get it in the temples of India and so on. And you can get it in nature. You can get these amazing moments of clarity where you suddenly understand that there's a level of consciousness that you can't normally access, but that is there. And of course, it is the pursuit of that path that gives life its meaning. And otherwise, the alternative to that is that it has no meaning. And most people, even those who accept it, don't actually stop and think it out. Some idiot, gambling on the stock market or something like that doesn't sort of sit and say, well, life really is meaningless, so I think I'll just make as much money as possible. They don't think it that way. They just say, well, that's what I'm doing, making as much money as possible, and I don't give a damn about anything else.
Right. Yeah, that is the meaning for them for their life, for their existence.
For them, yes. Although, when I don't travel in very wealthy circles very often, but even those people have their misgivings, and you get to put 6 drinks in them, and they start telling you all about their problems and stuff like that. And now actually, they're interesting, the work I'm doing with Jerry, with Salanti, because the richer, even the super rich are being massacred by this thing going on now. Of course, it's hard to feel sorry for them. Somebody has $2 billion and they lose 90% of their assets. They still have 200 million, but they think they're poor. But so this stuff is going on. But for the rest of us who don't have to worry about what to do with our $200 million, then it becomes, either your life has a meaning or it doesn't have a meaning.
Of course. It's something within us. And I wanted to ask you about this thing regarding both giving your life meaning, of course, but also regarding this strive, and we can connect this with the Egyptians, I guess, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but this strive for increasing or heighten your consciousness, your awareness, that also plays into this factor that you're how should I put it? You're nurturing your soul in a way. You're manifesting your soul, and you're adding more to your spirit if you are paying attention to these types of sciences. Do you think at this point that that's something that the Egyptians were interested into building, so to speak, on themselves, on their own spiritual life, and that gives you more meaning in life, meaning that this is a reciprocal cycle, if you will, and the people that are moving away from that, they're going to fall more into the dead zone, if you know what I mean.
Oh yeah, no, sure, of course, but as I said earlier, Egypt is a one-issue civilization. The entire civilization, yeah, they had their wars and things like that, but their creative energy. Actually, if you want to know what a civilization is like, or if you want to know the soul of a civilization, don't read history books. They're a waste of time for the most part. Look at where they directed their creative energy. Egypt is interesting because virtually all of the creative energy was devoted one way or another, even in the simple trades, let's say, of the carpenters and the statue makers and the shepherds and the herdsmen. All of those activities are transformational activities. All of them. Mm-hmm. They start off with a raw material of one sort and transform it into something alchemical, into something higher. So you have a whole civilization devoted to that aim. Then you have a real civilization. You look at where do we expend our creative energy? 70, who knows what percentage goes into the military. Another huge percentage goes into stupid bobblehead dolls in Disneyland, and a tiny little bit goes into the marginalized arts. Everything else is all that creativity expended, wasted on stupidity. That in fact does nothing for the soul. You look at Renaissance Italy, very interesting because it's brilliant. I mean, it's genius, but it's egotistic. Everything, look at me, how brilliant I am. Egypt, you don't get that. It's all anonymous. The pharaohs put their names on the temples, but there's a spectacular, simple grandeur to this work, and most of it anonymous. Now, people don't sign their names. Ahmed designed the statue. You just don't know. But the activity itself is transformational. So in Buddhism, Buddhism talks about the eightfold path.
Yes.
To detachment, and one lane within that eightfold path is right livelihood. If you're spending your life gambling on Wall Street, if your livelihood is, you're writing ads for some toothpaste or some damn thing or another, or working in a factory making horrible stuff that nobody wants or needs.
Yes.
It's very difficult to find that life path that will actually prove nurturing in and of itself. But it doesn't mean, actually, if you're not, it doesn't mean that you can't do it. Everyone has to make a living, so
of course,
not everybody can be a writer or a painter or an artist or a creator in that sense, especially nowadays. But as long as the message is driven home, and there are, as I said, there are my own focus is the Gurdjieff work, but that's a small thing, and it's not a small thing, it's a big thing, but it's not that well known. But there are disciplines, legitimate disciplines out there that can be followed. It's hard to do by yourself. You almost need a class to do it. It's like learning the violin by yourself. You can learn it, but you're much better off with a teacher. You can learn it by yourself, and then when you get to a certain point, you have to get a teacher to teach you what you're doing wrong so that you can do it right.
Yeah.
So there are schools in which you can pursue a path, but without the discipline, it's just in your head. It's a lot of New Age malarkey. So, yeah, but without that, there's no possibility of a civilization. So, going back to what we've been talking about on a number of instances here, as I said, the trick is to, first you have to recognize that the path is there,
Yeah.
and then you have to find a way. Then it has to become visceral and practical, and not just in your head. And that's the difficult part, unfortunately.
Yes,
but
of course.
without that, there is no civilization, nor can there be. Simple as that. It's without the understanding that we as human beings, individually and collectively, have a destiny to fulfill, nothing can happen.
That's interesting. And you know, if we were to talk about, for instance, a particular era or a particular dynasty in ancient Egypt, do you think there is one over another that enabled this more than another? I mean, we're talking about a long period of time here with all the kingdoms, all the pharaohs, and all the dynasties that have ruled Egypt. Do you particularly want to focus in on a particular era that like this is the high point of this particular civilization?
Actually, it's an interesting point, Henrik, because back to our Yuga cycle, Egypt, one of the mysteries is that it was at its absolute unquestionable height, very near its beginning, and gradually degenerated. So by the time it got into the Ptolemaic, finishing with Cleopatra, it was already degenerate, and you can see it in the art. Again, one of the great lessons of Egypt is to watch it deteriorate in front of your eyes, from the sort of unbelievable power and purity of the old kingdom to the flowery, ornate, decadent stuff that they were producing. Even so, still pretty spectacular compared to a Walmart.
Right.
But you can watch it. You can watch it degenerate in front of your eyes. But as I said this is. My belief is, I can't prove it, but my belief is that this is part of this natural long cycle of time, that when winter is coming, and that's all there is to it.
Right.
And now we're at a point, and I'm not exactly sure where it is, but analogically we're somewhere in, I'm inclined to think if I had to pick a date, somewhere like early February, and the blizzards are blowing, but underneath the earth is preparing itself, or being prepared to produce something new and valid and viable.
Really interesting. And I think that idea again is so interesting, that something can begin on its highest point. Because that again, if you think about it, goes against, if you will, then the Darwinian theory that things evolve and get better and better all the time.
Right.
But this is, I think Michael Creamer referred to it as devolution. He did a book, I think, on that. And
right.
Do you think that there's something to that? And if so, do you want to go so far as to say, yes, this is because there was a previous civilization, a high culture that basically moved into this area of Egypt, and then, or did it slowly progress up to this point and then fall away again? What's your take on that?
That's also an interesting point. It's very complicated. It shouldn't go to its height right from its beginning. I mean, it's a cycle, but something went on. My sense of it is, and there's now some evidence to back it up, that whenever the civilization that produced the Sphinx went down, in other words, with the breakdown of the Ice Age, whatever destroyed a former high civilization managed to live on, but there are these huge gaps, thousands of years, where not much seems to have been happening, but now the evidence is coming in. There was more happening than you think. Megalithic constructions, even in Egypt, stone circle down in Nabta Playa, west of Abu Simbel. So I'm inclined to think that perhaps the doctrine got passed on, even though they weren't manifesting it in sacred art and architecture. The doctrine got passed on, and when the time was right, again, suddenly, within a few generations, they were able to manifest it on this unbelievable scale. That's, to a certain extent, speculation.
Yeah.
All you can say, what isn't speculation, is that they did it.
Of course. So what you're saying is potentially that they had this knowledge all the time. They were into this particular science, then, if you will. But just when the timing was right, that's when they put this into stone, if you will, and manifested it as such. And that's what we're seeing when we're looking back, most prominently, of course, because this is still the monuments that we can look and in awe at and say, you know, how the heck did they do it? Yeah.
Yeah, you don't need to build in stone to be a civilization. In other words, you can have an extremely advanced, sophisticated civilization that expressed itself only in dance. Yes, and there'd be nothing left of it.
Of course.
You see that, for example, in those fabulous cave paintings in the Dordogne. I mean, whoever these people were geniuses. Maybe they were living in mud huts and wearing bearskins, but they were sophisticated people. And the same applies to what's left of the traditional cultures, the shamans of the rainforest and the Australian Aborigines. They don't need buildings in order to carry on the tradition.
Right.
The doctrine doesn't require a superstructure, really. I mean, it's just that with the superstructures there, you can go and enjoy it, whereas if you go to the rainforest, you don't know what the devil the shamans are doing. It doesn't, unless you take the ayahuasca, and then you can get a pretty good idea of it. But
right.
But you don't. It's not necessary to manifest it in cathedral, in Cathedral of Chartres or the Temple of Luxor or whatever. It's just that when they do that, then we, as degenerate progressive moderns, can actually understand what we're missing.
And it feels also to me then that this knowledge has been carried on in one form or another, because again, if they had the knowledge in ancient Egypt and the cathedral builders managed to pick that up or learn that onward, so to speak.
Yes.
Are there any, is this knowledge still in effect, still in does someone have the knowledge, if you will? Yes,
they do. I mean, that's Schroller's work. Sure, they have the knowledge. Yeah. The keepers of what's left of the traditional religions have it. The yogis and the Zen masters and so on. I mean, that's a practice. It's not just something you read about. It's something you do.
Yeah.
And there's Schroller's magisterial work that reproduces that really reformulates the sacred science. There's Gurdjieff's extraordinary work, which is, I caution people, it's not everybody's cup of metaphysical tea, but it's mine.
Right.
So yeah, it's there. I mean, you can access it, and you can access it, recognize its importance, but the key to it is the practice. You can listen to music. I do a lot, but I don't play it. So it's very different. What I experience out of music is profound and highly enjoyable, but it's not what Beethoven got out of it when he was writing it.
Yes.
So it's the practice that's the key to it, and of course the key is in these degenerate times hard to find because there's so much baloney out there, and then there's the whole counter movement of the Church of Progress telling us that it's all superstition.
Yeah.
So people have to find their own way.
Indeed, and I think that this is a good time here, John, to begin to wrap things up here. But if you have the time for us somewhere down the line here, would love to have you back, because there's simply so much more to talk about. The connection to alchemy, of course. We didn't even have time to talk about the Temple of Luxor now and really get into some of Schroller's work, of course, and what it was that he did. So some point, we'd love to have you back if you have the time for us, John.
Yep, I will, Henrik. I enjoy it, and I did warn you that I'm very digressive and long-winded. So
I had a great time, John.
Apologize for it.
No, definitely not. I had a great time, and we've managed to scope out a lot of interesting areas here, and I guess a little bit kind of set the preface for what we potentially might get into here if we do a second program here. But mention last time again your website, of course, so people can go there and find more of your work.
JAWest.net. not .com, .net, and all the information, contact information, and so on is there. And Henrik, you should join me in Egypt one of these days.
Well, I'd love to. Let me tell you that this is one of the big goals, if you will, that I have to get down there and see this with my own eyes. It's you can look at it in pictures, of course, with an all, but I guess it's a totally different experience.
Being
like
there. Sex.
Yeah.
Like sex. You have to experience it.
That's right.
But do it quick before the Middle East blows up, because that's very hard to imagine that something isn't going to happen there sometime not too far from now, particularly given our stupid government's behavior.
Yes.
It's designed to make things worse, not better.
So, okay, February you said.
Yes.
Then what's your plan? Do you have the next one scoped out already for when you're going to go down there? Or?
Well, I don't think the March one is going to go unless somebody comes up to me and says, I got 10 people to make it happen. So February, and then the next one will probably be in late October. That's my usual
late October
schedule.
Well, okay, let's stay in contact, John, and we'll see what happens.
Yes,
we never know, you know, because it would be such a blast to go down there and be there with you. Of course, would be great, but we'll see what happens, and definitely, I hope that everything will fall into place. So you can do it, of course.
Well, see, here's an incentive. I've done this before, actually. I don't know what your demographics are for red ice, but you put a red ice trip together of your listeners, and
yes.
Yeah, and you get a freebie.
That's a nice one. Yeah, definitely. I mean, let's look into that. That's okay. Really cool. We can make a little small documentary and show some of the people up back home that couldn't make it there or something. We'll see.
Well,
that's a great idea. Yeah. But let's stay in contact, John, and talk more about that. But again, to wrap things up here for the program, everyone listening, go to jawest.net. Do check out his website, his work, his books, his DVDs, and much more. Thank you again, John, for coming on. A blast having you here.
Thanks, Henrik.